Councillor Alexander, can you hear us?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to this meeting. The panel 3, Children's Services Committee. This is hybrid meeting. Members and officers are allowed to take part in online as well. However, regulation do not allow for members attending virtually to be counted as present in the attendance section of the minutes, and the attendance will not count as attendance in relation to Section 85, paragraph 1 of the Local Government Act 1972. Members attending virtually can speak through the chair, but would not be able to vote. Speaking at the meeting, attendees should speak through the chair, one at a time, for an orderly meeting to take place and enable accurate clerking of the proceedings. We have other attendance. We have a portfolio holder, Councillor Josh Blacker, attendance, and service officers, Robert South, Strategic Director of Children's Services, Julie Lewis, Director of Learning Standards and School Partnerships, John Redmond, Connections Manager, Crane Gill, Ealing Learning Partnership Quality and Partnership Lead, Andrew Martin, Head of Virtual School and Look After Children, Ian Jenkins, Head of Integrated Youth Services. So we get on to the agenda. Any apologies? Oh, okay. Yeah. Just Ian Jenkins is not with us today, but he's been substituted by John Redmayne, Connections Manager. Thank you. So, any apologies?
Yes, we have apologies for absence from Councillor Cordier and also from Councillor Kate Crawford. Councillor Daniel Crawford is substituting for Councillor Kate Crawford.
Thank you for substituting. Yeah. Any urgent matters? I'm not aware of any. Matters to be considered in private? Don't have any. Okay. Declaration of interest. Yes, Councillor Crawford.
Hello, Chair. I'm indebted to Mr. Redmond for reminding me that many years ago I was on the Connections Advisory Panel, and since we're probably going to discuss connections, I should declare it, but I don't believe it to be a prejudicial interest, Chair. Thank you.
Noted. That minutes of the last meeting, that was on the 18th of July. Do you agree? Thank you. Item 6 now, panel's work program. We have for April 15th, our work program is that Robert South has suggested adoption, permanence, and progress in special education needs. 2 items there. What do you think if I say if we can, early Ealing Learning Partnership as well is added, if it's possible? It's just a suggestion. It's what would it be possible? What the panel think?
Sorry, Dan. You're first. Well, look, I'm happy with it. It's a big subject. Maybe you could define it in some aspect, possibly, but otherwise, I think it's only good that we discuss it.
Okay. It is, yeah, check, yeah. Councillor Cross.
It's almost as though Councillor Gallant has taken the words out of my mouth. I think those 3 items are probably in need of some scoping. I don't think there's a lot of information, even within this report tonight, that covers some of those areas. So I think what would be wise is for us to look at the areas that come up tonight that provoke questions, and potentially it's an update in those 3 areas, or if that's what you and the Vice Chair would consider appropriate. But I think, because if we were going to do adoption, permanence and SEN, that's quite a hefty set of agenda items for the meeting. So I think while in principle I'm fine with it, let's have a look and see how we go tonight, and then yourself and the Vice Chair can scope what you think is appropriate for the 15th of April.
Yes, I'm happy with that, Chair. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. 11. Sorry, yeah. Oh. Oh, sorry. Well, item 7 is before we go, I think we're going the recommendation here is well, they have asked for recommendations. The officers asked to scrutiny panel or the committee notes the content this report and make any recommendations as we go along. Okay. Yes. And now is it Robert? Before we pass this on to Robert, would you like to say anything, Josh?
Sure, I think it has been mentioned, it is quite a hefty report, so I don't want to take up too much time. I think it does show, I think, some of the fantastic work that's going on. Not only is it good work, it's also better than our comparators in London. So I think, you know, this is a good news story for us. As you know from your last meeting, it was, you know, the impressively low numbers of care leavers not in education and employment and training was noted in the Ofsted report. So something that's been highlighted at that level as well. So look forward to hearing your thoughts on it and the panel's thoughts. If we can improve, we will. But I think that the team has done an impressive job. So good luck in trying to find some improvement for us. But look forward to hearing it. But I don't know if Robert and others want to say anything as well.
I think I'll leave it mainly to the team. I think it is a comprehensive report. What I would say is that we should be really proud in Ealing of our children and young people and their families and how they succeed. We are particularly keen to focus in and target our efforts, the efforts of the wider partnership within the community. So that will include our VCS partners and statutory partners, and working with parents and children and young people themselves who experience the greatest need. And you will see there's a number of groups of children and young people that we'll talk about tonight who've had some very challenging, traumatic early life experiences which get in the way of learning and development. But as a group of officers and as a local authority, it's our view that those children can succeed, can do very well, and do very well in many circumstances. But actually, we need to constantly be thinking about innovation, ways to engage them, and ways in which to create hope. And you know, I hope tonight that we'll have an opportunity to explore that, because we do want that challenge to get better where we can. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Julie Lewis.
Thank you. Would it be helpful for us to perhaps shine a light on some of the key areas in the report, and then we can pause either by section or at the end for questions?
How do you prefer question, as we go along or at the end?
Maybe in between each
In
section.
In between, okay.
Yeah.
Please, thank you.
Thank you. So what we've done with this particular paper is presented an overview of the work of Ealing Learning Partnership, our Send and Inclusion teams and the virtual school, Connections and Youth Justice in reducing and preventing the number of young people not in employment, education and training. And in the first section of the report, we've just pulled out some of the highlights, and Councillor Blacker has picked this up in his introduction. So first of all, looking at the local picture and trends in Ealing, if we look at page 20, you'll see that in Ealing, the number of young people who are not in employment, education or training is actually lower than London and lower than national. And that's been the case for many years. You might note a slight increase overall nationally and in London between last year and this year, and I think that's something worth noting, and we did see a slight increase locally as well. In terms of the data, each 1% represents approximately 95 young people, so it's always helpful to think about numbers. And within these figures, there are groups who are overrepresented, and so I'm just going to touch on each of those groups and then ask my colleagues to talk about the work we're doing in education and across the services to support those groups in particular, as well as all young people. So certainly young people with identified special educational needs and disabilities, and particularly those with an education, health and care plan, are overrepresented in our NEET figures. And we looked at 410 young people who had had an education, health and care plan, and of that group, just over 4% were NEET in 2024. But it's notable that that is still significantly less than the national of 9.2%. But we know we've got work to do in that area, and a whole area of our Send and Inclusion strategy is dedicated to preparing for adulthood and really supporting young people to be independent, to be able to use transport, and to have better support towards education, employment and employment related learning. The second group are those young people who are involved with the Youth Justice Service, and we looked at the percentage of young people in employment, education and training at the end of their Youth Justice Order. That has actually decreased over the last 3 years, so we are behind our target. And it's notable that just over 30% were not in employment and education and training on the last day of their order. So we'll touch on that later. The third group are our care experienced young people, and we're very proud. We've got tremendous outcomes for our care experienced young people through the work of the virtual school and our care leaver service. But of the group, we recorded 19% not in employment, education and training in 2024, but we still have some numbers to be confirmed. I'm just going to move to the next page because the chair was interested in particular in variations across the borough. And it's notable that there are 3 areas in particular where the percentage of young people not in employment, education and training is considerably higher than the borough average. North Holt, Mandeville and North Holt, West End wards and Greenford Broadway are the three areas with the highest number of young people in that category. And the other wards that were higher, notably, were North Acton, Norwood Green, Southall West, and in fact Southfield. So moving on to education, and we'll sort of pause after the education data section because Corinne is going to shine a little bit more light on the outcomes for children as they move through the education system.
So I suppose I'm going to be focusing on the section 3 and 7 of the report. So in terms of looking at students and young people that are eligible for free school meals, that would mean that they were eligible for a free school meal over the last 7 years. So we're looking more than just what we class as the pupil premium student, which would be students that are currently getting a free school meal. So in terms of progress, they're doing 0.26 better than the average, and this year we came in second place nationally for the Progress 8 measure, and on top of that, for English and maths combined, we've actually improved over the last 2 years to come in 5th in London. And this year the progress measure was positive 0.26. So and in level 3 we're also ranked 7th in London and nationally, and that again that's an increase from what it was previously from 2022. So we're working hard to try to ensure that those cohort of students that have been a focus for us in Ealing secondary schools are really focusing in terms of the work with connections in relation to trying to make sure that they're engaged, making sure they're not in employment, education or training. The Ealing Learning Partnership, so we have the Progression and Pathways Committee, which takes a real work with our stakeholders, with West London College, Connections, special educational needs schools, SEND inclusion strategy. And some of the major work that we've been kind of looking at this year is our careers networks. And you can see in the report, there's a whole area that we've been focusing in on in terms of the careers network to try to get the area that we're trying to focus on, which is the Gatsby standards. So nationally, we're 90% for all our Gatsby standards across all Ealing secondary schools. There's 2 areas that we got a particular focus on, which is the Gatsby Benchmark 6, which is about experiences in the workplace, and Gatsby Benchmark 8, which is about the provision of personal guidance. And one of the reasons for that is as more organisations have gone into home working, there's not as many opportunities for young people to go to a workplace, but that is a priority for us moving forward. We've also focusing in on the apprenticeship route, so we're working hard trying to offer more level 2 opportunities because we don't have enough of them at the moment inside Ealing, and that is something that has been fed back. This year we were really proud was we, for the first time, ran an event looking at level 2 careers fair, which was the first one that we did, which was looking at focusing at students that are a level 2 or below, and parents were invited alongside our secondary schools and members of the community. I think we had over 300 attendees there, and the feedback has been really positive, and we're going to be expanding that for next summer. And the focus there is with our current year 10 and 11, and the targeted group of students is the ones that are potential NEETs in those schools. So we speak to each school to kind of get a list of the students they feel could be NEET in a year's time. And this was the first time, so this year we're hoping that's going to have an impact on our NEET figures because we started the work last year to try to make sure there's opportunities for them inside Ealing. There's also, we've done a lot of work with West London College and Connections for the current students that were NEET last year at December. And I know West London College offered, working alongside Connections with the students that were classed as NEET, courses that they could come and the opportunity to entice them to get them back into college. And I think there was 104 students and 30 we were successful to try to get them into West London College, who have continued last year and completed with a qualification. So we're spending a lot more focus on looking at our primary school engagement, because we're recognising that we need to start earlier. So there's a lot of work going on in terms of the primary schools, and we have secured some free programmes for this academic year, especially around social enterprise academies. We've got like poets in residence, as well as taster sessions that are being offered by employers to our primary schools. So we're trying to get the careers education model between primary and secondary more aligned, so that students are more aware of what they should be arriving and where they want to go. We're working hard, as Julie said, looking at the support for young people with SEND. So we work particularly well with the Ealing Learning Partnership SEND lead, looking at meeting with our SEND colleagues to make sure as part of the education healthcare plans, so those students on EHCPs, there is actually a section that's discussed with parents directly of where do they want their child to be going next and what support can we offer. And that's part of our regular contact with secondary schools. The area that we're really focusing on is a bit up in the air, is obviously the post-16 provision, because that's all on hold in terms of the curriculum updates. We're expecting a review in December, which will possibly could have an impact in terms of vocational education offer inside Ealing, because it depends if the BTECs will continue. And also there's the big curriculum review, which we're expecting from the DFE in early next year. So that's something that we're still focusing on. The other area that we're still focusing hard on is making sure that our Black Caribbean progression to higher education, the data is suggesting that as it currently stands, we don't have enough students from that cohort going to the higher tariff universities. So this year, as part of our Insight to University programme, we put 24 students on that programme, so they're having mentoring, and we're hoping by December this year, they will put in applications for some of the higher tariff universities. I think those are pretty much the highlights from the education sector. I suppose it's open for questions.
Any questions? Yes, Councillor Gillard.
Thank you, Chair. Could we just think about very quickly about EHCP? We hear a lot about it, and you know, I'm talking about, I'm learning here. We hear about how sometimes it's hard to set up, and some, you know, who has access to it? How is it set up? Do you think there's is it a fair measure in its own right?
Sorry, could you repeat
Well,
the question?
because you mentioned that it's mentioned a lot, and all I'm saying is that what we hear around is that some children it's easier, they have an easier time than others getting onto EHCP. Is that correct?
Oh, you're talking about a request for statutory assessment and being issued with a plan.
Exactly that, yeah.
I suppose it's not directly related to the paper, but it's fair to say that nationally and in Ealing we have significantly rising demand for requests for statutory assessment, and therefore ultimately, you know, it's there's the pressure on resources is that much greater. So what we are working with our schools to do at the moment is to get consistency in terms of what is universally provided for children who do have additional needs, to strengthen the quality of the offer by mobilising specialist support from school to school, as well as, you know, relying on council-run services, so that those children who do need a plan get one. So that's what.
Thank you. Councillor Crawford.
Thank you. So I think the first thing to say is thank you for the detail. I'd echo what Councillor Blacker and Mr. South have said. It's very comprehensive. It's probably one of the most detailed reports I've seen in all of my time on the council with so much information. And the first thing to say is to commend everybody from our education team, all of yourselves and all of our students and teachers and everybody involved in the education sector for what they're doing, because I think there is a point that Julie has mentioned in answer to the previous question. The demand level for, particularly for children with SEND, is only going to increase. The resourcing is a year-by-year battle, I think, for each institution that's involved in doing that. And that's I've got 3 questions, Chair. That's my first question. How do we ensure that there's that consistency of offer for SEND students, particularly when we're not looking at something that's one size fits all? The ideal is that you're tailoring your support, your advice, and your signposting, if you like, to future employment opportunities to that individual. You know, that's really hard. How are we progressing on that, and to what extent do we learn from some of those young people's experiences themselves who've perhaps gone through the pathway already?
Thank you. I mean, driving consistency school to school is what we're about in the partnership. I think we're very fortunate to have such a vibrant school to school way of working here. We call it lateral accountability. So head teachers hold each other to account, and that's really helpful. And that's also beginning to pay dividends in terms of SEND. So, for example, our primary schools are linked in triads, clusters, and the SENCOs, the special educational need coordinators, will be actively conducting peer inquiry and review in each other's schools. And that helps to drive, we call it fear of missing out and fear of letting down kind of mindset. And what it actually does over time is it begins to raise standards and also reduce variation. And that's really helpful. So that as those young people become older and start to think, you know, especially in year 9, which is a very important time for looking at the plan, education, health and care plan. And I'm sure Andrew will talk about this a little bit later. Those plans should have really, you know, high expectations in terms of preparing for adulthood and the progression routes and pathways that the school is supporting the child to prepare for. And that's another thing that we're trying to drive consistency around, particularly in year 9. Did you want to say something about the link between careers and the SENCO network?
I think one of the key concerns that we always have is making sure that SEND students with EHCPs, have got advice from an early start point. But one thing that they all get as part of the education healthcare plan is they will all have a connections meeting. So that will be a one-to-one. So every student in Ealing will get that as a provision, as an entitlement in every secondary school. But I think the other thing is that we do in the careers networks, every meeting there is a section in terms of students with special educational needs about what opportunities are coming up in terms of the labour market inside Ealing, what opportunities are coming up for apprenticeships, what support they can get. And we've kind of, as part of the Ealing Learning Partnership, we have linked up with the parent groups within Ealing to be able to offer work experience opportunities for those students to try to get them engaged and interested in a pathway. From year 9, we kind of start doing that work so that we can engage them. And I suppose in the question that you were asking earlier about each school and the individual, I suppose the SEND lead, which whether it's a senior leader or the SENCO that leads that department, they have built up quite a rapport with each individual student. So they are in the best position to know the families, what the child's interest is. And that can change year on year. So it's not an approach that can be used, but each school will use an approach that fits them in relation to the student's body that they've got in front of them.
So just very quickly then, Chair, sorry, I had to, first of all, that's really good. I remember having to ask for a connections appointment all those years ago when I was at Twyford. So I'm glad to hear that that's standardised now particularly for students with SEND. Just 2 points on some of the things that Corinne was mentioning as areas to pick up on. The first around that market offer, that employment signposting, particularly for students with SEND, and related to the table, because my ward is one of those wards. on page 23, the variation in neat figures across the borough by ward. I was talking about this with John just before the start of the meeting. The really interesting thing is how much external engagement we can get from employers within this process. And I know that's quite difficult given the time frames, but we have three major employers within North Acton alone now, with massive plans to, I can see Robert's already nodding, he knows what I'm going to say, I think, with massive plans to make huge change across not just North Acton, but the wider borough of Ealing. So that's HS2, the OPDC, and even the Elizabeth line itself. I'd be really excited to explore with somebody how we can get some of those students involved in some of those pathways, because there are just so many career opportunities. They're not necessarily things that would immediately appeal or come through classroom learning either. So they'd appeal to the very types of students that I imagine John and his team are dealing with, that Andrew and his team are dealing with. It'd be really interesting to see if we could get some more of those opportunities going. And I'm sure my colleagues from other parts of the borough will have other businesses, be they small businesses or larger businesses, that could contribute to that process.
Yes, I think in the secondary schools we do like mock interview days where employers. So I think we'd be really interested if you've got a list of people that we could contact, because that's something that we are trying to grow, to make sure that students feel that they are prepared to go for interviews. And I think in terms of HS2, we've done quite a lot of work, and then it kind of was put on halt last year with everything that was happening. But there's been they've worked quite extensively with our secondary and primary sector colleagues in trying to bring it alive, what it could look like for the area. And this year we've kind of linked up with the skills and employment strategy in terms of looking at what jobs are likely to be in Ealing in the next 3 to 5 years. And we're working closely with our colleagues there to kind of think, how are we going to filter that? And they're going to be joining the Progression and Pathways Committee to make sure that we're all trying to keep Ealing students within Ealing jobs.
I'm just conscious on HS2, they made some very strong commitments to local workforce, and even to the extent of providing opportunities for people who wouldn't always have those from a diverse background. So that's not just SEND, that's ethnicity and gender and everything, and we should be at the front of the queue. The other thing was, you were talking about the Black and Afro-Caribbean students to higher tariff universities. I wondered how we were getting on with that. Obviously that's a work in progress, and I'm thinking of sort of 5 or 6 constituents of mine who've had great success in various different fields, who could be useful to help in respect of speaking to some of those students or advancing that program. But Chair, that might be something we can take offline following the meeting. I know they'd be really keen, having lived in Acton and the borough, to offer some of those experiences to some of these children, and that might spark some progress. But I'd just like to make the offer on behalf of those individuals.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I think what we are working hard in terms of the ethnic cohort is we've done a lot of work over the last 2 years, starting with our year 7s and 8s and 9s, because obviously if we could get them engaged, and for the first time, because I do link officer visits to every high school every term, and for the first time last year we've got no differential in terms of data for our year 9s, and so in a couple of years' time we should start to see the progress data, the gap starting to absolutely close for that cohort. And I think as the Ealing Learning Partnership, we kind of made a focus on the year 7, 8 and 9 to see whether we can start to change those mindsets and get higher levels of parental engagement by having parent ambassador groups. So secondary schools are setting up for the race equality cohort parent ambassador groups. So I think we're on that journey at the moment so that's real interesting in terms of trying to get, because this year as part of the Progression and Pathways, we're looking for more role models and from that ethnicity background to come into secondary schools and kind of tell their story to kind of engage further where they would like to go. So that would be really interested, and we've got a race quality colleague that would be really excited by that.
I'm just conscious, Chair, that some of our MATs and some of our schools are much better set up with alumni networks and bringing people into classrooms and even into pupil referral units at a much more advanced stage. And I know the Learning Partnership is set up to try and share some of that knowledge. I just wonder how widely it's able to sort of percolate organically, and whether that's something where we could ask. I'm certainly happy to go and speak to my head teacher. My head teacher is still the same. My ex-head teacher is still the same head teacher. I'm certainly happy to get her to try and spread some of the wealth around the partnership, because sometimes they need a little bit of prodding. But I'll leave it there, Chair, before I get into trouble.
Thank you.
Councillor Kingston, and after that it may Councillor Kwanzaa.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, do you sort of measure at all like multi-generational needs? So, example, the parents and possibly their grandparents aren't currently in work and have never really been in work at all, and how do you sort of reach out to these?
So we don't measure it in that sense, but what we do get is we get a Ronnie report, and I'm not sure what Ronnie stands for. The risk of need for when they arrive in secondary school in year 7, which would take into account some of the factors that you've described. So basically, when they arrive in year 7, we already know which possible students have never had an experience of going to university, because they've got not, so that they kind of get a career pathway that starts from year 7, because they've already been identified. So each secondary school gets that by about October half term. Based off the data that we know of their family. So that's the way we kind of try to tailor it for those year 7s straight away as soon as they get to secondary. But those students, what happens is, as part of my link officer visits, we like to make sure that those year 7, we can actually see that there's engagement. But for those particular students, we then also look at their attendance, their progress data, because each school will probably have like 10 to 12 students, unless they're in a particular school, there might be higher numbers. But then we kind of follow up to see what support have they had, what sort of offer are they getting, and whether their parents are involved with the school, because have they been to parents' evenings, for example. So we kind of try to keep, that's a different group that we monitor, and they sometimes fall into that free school meals and into other categories, but we try to make sure that we keep an eye on them as a distinct cohort.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Kwanzaa.
Apologies, my hand was probably up by accident, but I just wanted to say, going back to the point about the Race Equality Commission and hoping to see some results come in the next few, more progress between the disparities between African, especially Caribbean children and their contemporaries and achievements levels. I just wanted to say that Park Parents Action Resource Centre have been very proactive in providing parent forums which are making an impact in Ealing schools, and I just wanted to know what the panel thinks about this. Are you aware of the parent forums that are giving parents, a bit like pupil ambassadors, parent ambassadors and all this, just to see that you're aware that there's other things that are impacting upon schools through parent forums? And also I think Ealing Learning Partnership too have been collaborating with Park, because I went to a meeting last Saturday at Young Ealing Foundation where this was discussed. That's it really, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we are. We've commissioned Park to support us with our work directly with families, and it's quite an innovative piece of work, and we're really looking forward to it. So thank you for raising that. I'm going to hand over to, I think, John next, and talk a little bit about connections.
Sorry.
Councillor, before John comes in, I was just thinking that we've been talking earlier in the meeting in terms of the forward plan of work. and activity. We had discussed Ealing Learning Partnership. So the conversation that we just had in terms of Black Caribbean boys, some of the work from the race equality engagement piece, that might be an area that we want to have a fuller discussion about here. I just flagged that because it's something that's come up at a few points tonight, so I just wanted to capture that. So I think that might be useful, and it is also on the Ealing Learning plan, the Ealing Learning Partnership plan. Just something for your consideration. I just thought if we got it now, we don't lose it later.
Yes, I think
Apologies.
that we can add to our work program for future. Yes. Sure. Yeah, sure. Sure. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. In my view, Connections does three things on behalf of the council. The first is it covers off the statutory responsibilities that each council have, which is reporting on NEETs, and the other side of that coin is not knowns. And it's very important to have both low. Ealing is really good at that. London is good, and England is okay at that. But you know, we're good within all those, and they are two sides of the same coin, and both are important. So we do the statutory things. We then also, Connections also sells its careers service, its careers advisor time into secondary schools. And virtually every mainstream and special secondary school in the borough buys into that service. Some buy quite a lot, some buy a lot, and some buy, in my humble opinion, not quite enough. But you know, that's an ongoing discussion that we have every year. And that is, for those of you old enough to remember the original careers service, that's the careers advisor coming into school, discussing your options as you leave school. But that these days is bought in service, and some, let's say, some schools buy quite a lot and some don't. And then the third thing, which is what this paper really concentrates on, is it works with young people that have left school that are either wanting to change career or more likely are NEET or right on the edge of being NEET. And it works really hard with lots of those young people. As you can see, there are about 100 or so at any one time. And we do all sorts of things to try and make them eat. But we still seem to be stuck with about 100. It's not necessarily the same 100 throughout the year, but it's a reasonably constant figure of about 100. And try as we might, sometimes we just can't find them. We know they exist because they were at school and they might be living in Manchester, but no one's told us. So, you know, obviously we can't help them because we can't find them. But most of them we can find. And we work really hard with all sorts of colleagues around this table and elsewhere in this building and in the voluntary sector and so on, trying to make them, as I say, make them eat and go off and lead happy, fulfilled lives and so on. And you know, we're pretty good at that really on the whole, but there is this stubborn figure of young people that really do need some additional support, and we provide it. Lots of people provide it where they can, but there is more that could be done, in my opinion.
Crawford, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Forgive me, I feel like my life has rather gone full circle because I'm about to recommence a conversation I started with John probably 20 years ago, I imagine. So the first thing is, I think John's been very modest in terms of the reach of Connections and its success. Just the report itself talks about the vast number of people who receive that connection service. And I think one of the problems we have in terms of ensuring there's 100% take up is we don't talk enthusiastically enough about some of those success stories and the reach of the service. We're obviously concerned this evening with the NEET element of the cohort, but I would go as far as to say, Chair, that the low numbers of NEETs is largely down to not just the work within the schools themselves, but a lot of that early intervention from connections, from a teacher or somebody who's spotted a child with potential and given them that signpost. That's certainly the case in my own experience. Just a couple of things on the information that's in front of us. I wonder how much more we could do in all of these areas with the resources that we'd like to provide these services. You know, Councillor Blacker is experienced enough to know that it's one of the areas that I care passionately about in respect of our young people. And I think if we were being candid this evening, the achievements of the people who are sat here to answer these questions are so vast and successful, given how little resource we have. Just two questions that flow from that. We talk about in the penultimate paragraph on what is page 25 on my papers, talking about 112 employers being involved in the events that were attended by more than 1,500 young people. That speaks to the scale. And then the refocus events after A-level and GCSE. I mean, it's anecdotal in some ways, but I've had 5 or 6 young people write to me over the course of the last year talking about how important those events were in terms of securing them something they could go into when they didn't think they were going to do that necessarily. It's opened up a career path. And I just wonder about, with the number of community spaces that we've got, and we have discussions, Chair, in different committees and different parts of this panel, if there are lessons that we can learn from connections, to Councillor Kingston's point about people who fall out of our grasp because they go out of full-time education, if there are ways with that approach that we can learn to enticing people back to education, training, skills, employment, I think it'd be a really interesting thing to look at, because if you don't get these people back into that sphere, they can become economically inactive, as we all know. And the last point is talking about the majority of the again, 15,000 individual interventions with nearly 6,000 young people. So I get there that the majority, as the report states, the majority of those are within schools themselves, because as Mr. Redmond has said, most of our schools buy in. I'd like to have a conversation with the people who don't, but there we are. But the interesting one for me is the conversations in community settings. Now, those conversations can take various forms. The sort of formal conversation is probably not as successful as peer-to-peer opportunities. And I wonder if there's something we can do alongside the apprenticeship service and alongside some of our borough's own apprentices about speaking to young people, having days in the borough's 7 towns. If the 7 towns model, you know, as we roll out that 7 towns model in particular settings where people are likely to be, to sort of make them aware of what's available. It's never going to be cool or always going to be attractive to people who probably don't want to be having these conversations. But I feel like the success rate is so good when we generate these conversations that we need to look at that. And I do think we need to look at how we can concentrate, how we can target our resource, because I took that from both Julian and Corinne's introductions to this section. It's about those targeted interventions, and here is somewhere where we know the quality of those conversations has a direct impact on what people end up going and doing. So I wonder if there's sort of some more targeting that can be done, whether that's by employer, whether that's by geographical location, what that is in terms of the breakdown. I don't know, but I feel like this is a real, both Councillor Blacker and Mr. South spoke about the success stories that we have within this report. This is one of them. We just need to give this service and all of these services a little bit more opportunity to sell themselves effectively.
Okay. Councillor Glenn?
Yeah, that's very interesting then. Lot in there. I also like to say we had a chat, John, earlier on about how effective it can be with professions, sometimes professions which have clear career paths, and then there are other professions which have very unclear career paths. And what you're doing is you're bringing people with experience in and talking to youngsters and helping them find themselves and find that path. And that I mean, there's no end to that. There's no end to that. It's going to take just more and more application. But the question is, I mean, your success is obvious, and you are being modest about it. But you are talking about 100 or so pupils who you have trouble with. And what I mean, I don't want to say give the three things which frustrate you the most. But what are you lacking? What stops you doing what you want to do?
So in my opinion, as you know, the vast majority of young people are absolutely fine. They receive appropriate interventions and they move on to suitable opportunities in education, training, employment. But for that tiny number that don't, it's easy enough to engage a lot of them. Some of them you'll never get. You can't ever find. They just don't want to know. Okay, so I'll hold my hands up and go, there's not a lot we can do with them today. Maybe tomorrow, but not today. But for those that we can engage, if you go down to Bollowbrook Youth Centre or Greenford Library or Northolt, you will see a connections advisor sitting there, probably sitting there, might be playing table tennis or pool or something, but that's their way of engaging. They will get that young person and they'll come up with a plan. But sometimes the thing that's missing, they're not ready to go straight into a full-time job, a full-time college course, or a full-time apprenticeship. They need a stepping stone. We've done this in the past, externally funded. We've done it dozens of times. I can show you a teacher now who is, I don't know, 30 years old, who was very, very unengaged as a 16-year-old. She came to us. She did a year with us on a free, so she didn't earn any money, but we got her engaged. She came, she started coming every day, and then she got an apprenticeship. She then went on to university, got a first-class degree, and is now a teacher over in Hounslow, as it happens. But if somebody somewhere hadn't engaged her, I guarantee she would not be doing that now. And it's that stepping stone, I think, for people that aren't quite ready, that just need a little bit of something. We've got something going for care experienced young people. It's called Pathways. Council supports it. It's a work experience program, really, lots and lots of support, and that is showing good results. But it's not a 0 to 60 miles an hour thing. It's a you know, you need little steps. And it works. It doesn't work for everybody, but it really does work, and it's hugely cost effective in the long term, massively so, in my opinion. So if I had the magic wand, that's the one thing I would do.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Crawford.
Yeah, building on that then, I think this is the really interesting part of scrutiny for me. And what we're talking about are placements or work experience for people who they've left school, so the school doesn't have the ability. Well, they might do these days to 18, I guess. But if you're going to 18, you're technically in education, aren't you? So you wouldn't fall into this cohort that we're talking about. we're talking about placements or work experience for people who've left school but aren't quite ready to go into full-time work and haven't, for whatever reason, been seduced by the superb apprenticeships team that we've got that goes around to businesses or whatever. I wonder if there's something we can look at for some sort of pilot program or some sort of small-scale scheme that looks at in some of those locations that where we already have those careers advisors, whether they're at Bollowbrook, whether they're at Northolt, whether they're in Pitshanger, somewhere where we've already got a presence. Is it possible that we could look at a placement scheme or something for you know, we're talking about 5 places across the borough for some of these young people to work directly with the connection service at looking at what that pathway looks like. Now, I'm doing this off the back of a conversation. It'll be a resource intensive, it'll be a funding thing, but if that's what we're, you know, the potential of that should at least be explored somewhere along the line.
Crawford, yeah, Councillor.
Following on from that, but what you're saying is you're looking for something more informal, actually, aren't you? Because you're saying that the formality of an apprenticeship or that placement is just too much. You're looking for something more kind of something looser. And I suppose perhaps you've got to look at try and establish relationships with people of experience, employers, and so on, who are happy to host on that informal basis rather than to take someone on and in a particular role or capacity.
Just to add to that, yes, it needs to start off part-time for some of these people. They can't handle 5 days a week, 35 hours a week from doing nothing to that. It's just that simple.
It's the capacity issue, isn't it? It's actually getting the principal people in the room and creating that space. So I don't know if that's one we can take away or even have like a working group to look at as a result of people who might be interested from this panel.
If I may just comment. So I think one of the things that we've heard, we're talking about a small group of young people. And for many of these young people, as John has suggested already, they're often in very challenging situations. There may be familial difficulties, which might involve child protection issues, could involve extrafamilial harm such as criminal exploitation, sexual exploitation of children and young people. And these are some of the reasons that John was indicating there, why those young people might be very difficult to get in touch with, and why they might find it difficult at times to commit to certain activities. I think you're right that we need to think about more creative ways. There is a halfway house between no activity, for instance, and apprenticeships, and those are referred to as traineeships, or they were before, and there may be different language now, John. And sometimes, yes, we do need to seek investment, etc. Now, I think it's really important. I had a meeting earlier this week with the DFE, and I'm anticipating that there will be opportunities arising shortly following the budget, where we may, with other local authorities, be able to bid for various opportunities through grant funding. So I think that might be an opportunity. But we do have a relatively new assistant director who covers the area that John works in, and we are, always on an ongoing basis reviewing opportunities. So, happy to take this away as part of our work programme to look at those opportunities. Obviously, it would be down to the committee to consider what the committee might want to do further as a way of taking this forward.
Okay, Councillor Crawford.
So I think the feedback is really useful. Certainly, we're going to need to be flexible and innovative, I think, in how we look at this. But I think it's one that I'd like to propose as a recommendation, as something that could be considered. I'd like to be as optimistic as the officer that we're going to be able to have that funding come through as part of what is going to be a very tough budget process. I'd like to hope so, but I think from the safeguarding element of what you were saying, that's obviously paramount. We have to make sure, but I think with all the talent that's within the local authority, with all our experience of dealing with what is a really tough cohort, we want to be aiming for the very best, particularly for those young people. To say to them, as we do in this report, that whatever's gone before you, whatever your circumstances, whether you've had a tough upbringing, whether, as Councillor Kingston has alluded to, you've never had any familial experience of employment or education, higher education, that shouldn't prohibit you making a progression and you experiencing those opportunities. So I think, I'll leave it to the chair and the vice chair about how they scope this, but I think there's potential for us to look at offering Mr. Redmond and his colleagues who are here this evening the opportunity of a bit more flexibility in terms of what would be at its initial phase, a very small, pilot program, because we're only talking about 100 or so people, and I think, as charismatic as John is, he's not suddenly going to be able to persuade all 100 of them to join a scheme like this. But if you could get 5, if you could get 10, and if we could demonstrate that flexibility that local authorities aren't always good at and businesses aren't always good at, they want someone for the 9 to 5 all the time, don't they? We say to them, this is something where we're going to develop this program tailored to those individuals and to their circumstances. I think, it's not beyond the wit of the people sitting around this table to make that work, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, just thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Good evening, councillors. To give you a quick overview of the virtual schools function for avoiding NEET and having our children in care engaged in employment or training is a really good opportunity tonight. So the statutory function for the virtual school is around children in care, but this evening you've also heard about other cohorts of young people who the virtual school has a remit to sort of shine a light on, and that's children in need and child protection. If there's any opportunity in the future to talk about those young people, but you've heard about them because they come under the all-encompassing work of colleagues. For our care experience young people, last year the work that was put in place was really focusing on making sure that we were tracking and following the data and where those young people were on roll and what they were doing. We've developed that further, starting for this year, where we now have, for our post-16 young people, actual attendance data of their engagement in college or sixth form, which means we're then able to get a better gauge of if things are beginning to go wrong for them, and so we'll be able to avoid young people becoming NEET. In the report that you have, it's very clear that 58% of the cohort are EAT. Because of work that's been going on, that's now at 67%. There are still a few more young people to track down, and out of the 112 young people who are care leavers post-16, the reason we're still tracking is because some of these young people change courses. They move home, and so their education provider would also change. So that work is ongoing. Last year we put a sharper focus on how we used our Pupil Premium Plus grant and making sure that we had a needs-led approach, which meant that young people were receiving support that was identified by their teachers and by their social workers. And that meant that actually we knew that we were really targeting the young people and meeting their needs. Currently, we now have our outcomes for summer 2024. They are showing an improvement on previous years. They've actually improved on a few years ago as well, and that's partly down to the tracking, but it's also because we know that the majority of our school-age children are in schools attending, and those schools are at the best Ofsted grades as well. When we're then thinking about the support that we put in place for our children, the use of the personal education plan, which is a statutory document for our children in care, is absolutely fundamental. The work that we had last year with our use of PEPs is very, very helpful, because it gives coverage of all children, both in statutory school age and into post-16 work. We've now refined that so that we've moved to an online document where a personal education plan is then a genuinely shared document, completed live by social workers, school, college leaders, which will then give us much more up-to-date, to-the-minute data around our children. Again, which will enable us to anticipate if things are going wrong, and then to put in place preventative work. When I wrote this report, we were in a position to say that we had interviewed for a worker who focused specifically on level 1 and level 2. This evening, I'm able to report to you that worker has now taken up her post. She's in her first week, admittedly, but she's started. But that's really an important role, because it will allow a worker to give attention to children on level 1 and level 2 courses, and prevent or do work to prevent them dropping out of those courses, which will therefore contribute to a reduction in future NEET figures. We've heard this evening around risk of NEET, and the care cohort, actually 100% of them are risk of NEET, and that's because of the profile that those young people have when they enter care, which Robert's already alluded to, with familial experience, neglect, and so on in their pre-care experience. And so with that awareness, those children also have the high likelihood of having special educational needs in their profile, or needing an EHCP, and in fact just about a third of the cohort have an EHCP. Ealing's children are also educated and live not just in Ealing, but across the UK. And so my team therefore liaise with and work with schools, other local authorities, other SEN departments where those children are living. So therefore, making sure that the local provision is made available to those children where they are is also fundamental. And so the work that we're putting into that is vital. And the additionality of a new member of staff is going to just add to that as well. So I'm very pleased to report that that's in process. I'm going to turn now to page 31, which is to do with PFA. And so I touched on the SEND profile of the children in care, partly as a sort of an introduction just to change tack and move into preparation for adulthood for SEN. Much of the work that the PEP does is about enabling preparation for adulthood for our children who are looked after. The SEN focused work here, of course, is for children with HCPs across not just care experience. This is now back to all children. And so, as Julie mentioned earlier, from year 9 onwards, so from about the age of 13 or 14 onwards, having conversations around what are you going to do when you grow up? What are you going to do when you're, for your career? How are you going to have your own family is fundamental, and is really important for that planning over time. The education, health and care process calls for an annual review. And so, as Corinne mentioned, what children want to do and what families want to do over time also then changes. And it's vital that that PFA process is running annually within that within what's happening. So the strategy and the focus on PFA is key. It's key for offset inspection that is likely to be coming fairly soon. And it's about joining up the strategies that schools have, that colleges have, making sure that the voices of young people and also that what their parents, the young people's parents, are saying around the next steps for their children. And the work that's being put in place at the moment is ensuring that we have children going on to internships and that those young people then are converting those into employment or offers of employment. It's making sure through our youth network that the voices of young people are being heard. We had a very successful first conference last year. Sorry, I say last year, I think in school years, this calendar year, but back in May, April-May time, was really powerful in enabling young people to say, this is what we want, this is our ambition for our futures. And the work and energy that we need to be putting into going forward is about employers understanding that children with disabilities, children with the more complex needs within their EHCPs are still able to succeed and contribute to the working environment, to be paid a wage and move on and have those brilliant, fulfilling lives we all want them to have. There's a lot of work happening in the PFA sphere, but it's a really exciting place, and pieces of work. Have any questions at all?
Councillor Crawford.
Thank you. Sorry. Mr. Martin, the first thing to say is thank you for the phenomenal work that you and your team are doing. You mentioned the conference. I had some correspondence from parents and young people about how they've been involved in that, and given that opportunity wasn't around for people like me to shape that conversation and to take, well, it was, I used to bend John's ear, but to have our young people as part of this co-production agenda, to be confident enough in the first instance to lead some of that work, to share their own experiences, and also the expansion of virtual school out of COVID and all these other things that we've done. I really think it's an exemplary programme. And in terms of what you've hit on at the end of the report, PFA, which I sort of glibly refer to as transition because it's what it was called when I was going through that process. It's so important, but it's so inspiring to see that we have taken the ball and run with it in terms of putting those young people in the driving seat. And I'm supposed to be using this time for a question, Chair. So I think what it should be is, I completely agree with what you're saying about those conversations we have to have with employers and partners about young people with, firstly, our care leavers who are wonderful and inspirational, but actually much more than that, they're taking that journey supported by ourselves into prosperity and into fulfilling livelihoods, which is remarkable in and of itself, given the difficulties that they've experienced. But I think also some of the conversations that I have with young people is they can be involved in the design and shape of businesses. They might even be the entrepreneurs of the future themselves, because and mainly shaped by those lived experiences that they've had. So the question I was going to ask is, do we have contact with either care leavers who've come through the process and are involved as role models, or as supporters or mentors, if you like, for those young people, whether that be care leavers and or children would send or young people would send, and how much scope is there for us to build on what is, as I said, a phenomenally successful and really inspiring program.
Thank you. Yes, so I am talking about two separate things here, but they are related. But within the PFA work last year, there is a reverse mentoring scheme where young people, adults are able to meet with and work with council leaders and these young people have disabilities or lived experience around SEND, and so it enables, and it's, we all know how reverse mentoring works. It enables those leaders to meet with over 3 different occasions to develop their understanding of how this young person can contribute and work and succeed. It's really powerful because it is lending itself absolutely to that co-production piece, and there's a desire to build on that more and more. The conference, it needs to go on record. There's a particular officer that led and drove that. It wasn't me, and he's inspirational, and he has that absolute lived experience, and he's at work upstairs every day, and is driving that agenda. For care leavers, yes, the leaving care team hold on and maintain contact with our young people beyond 25, but absolutely from a virtual school perspective, we have young people at university, young people who go on into postgrad work and then go on into employment, and we will continue to engage with them as long as there is some kind of educational justification to continue to engage with them. I mean, I could have written at length about our care leavers, but this is about needs and eats. And so our level 3 and our university pathway young people are, I would suggest, national leaders really in what we get. To have 18, 19, 20% of the cohort engaged in university studies is very unusual for care leavers. And again, this year we have another tranche of young people going to university, and locally and further afield. So we maintain those links and we want them to come back. With the PEP as an illustration, which is it's still on my to-do list, but I'm wanting to engage with a care leaver to do a video with him to provide guidance to school leaders about why capturing the young people's voice is so important within the PEP, and how that can then lead and inspire and develop future learning and goals. So I'm in the process of organising that currently.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's an incredible work. I echo that and what you've explained. Just go back to you're working with a lot of children outside the borough as well. Are these children who've moved out, and how's that?
Absolutely. So we have approximately, it does change, but approximately 40% of our care, our CLA, our children looked after, are resident and attend school in Ealing. We go to then about 70%, or another 30% are within touching distance of Ealing and somewhere in London, and the remaining 30% are placed and live with foster families across the UK, and it's based on, and the reason young people can be moved can be wide ranging, but essentially those children are placed in the best foster provision to meet their needs and circumstance to do with care proceedings.
And you just keep tracking them?
Yeah, the statutory guidance requires the virtual school head is a statutory role, and as such the local authority or the head is required to track the CLA cohort as if they're in one school, irrespective of where they are.
you, Councillor Blacker.
Yeah, just picking up on what was mentioned about the reverse mentoring. I'm doing it just to confirm to the panel that, you know, when we talk about council leaders, it's not just officers. I'm doing it as portfolio holder as well. And I think in my first session with the young person, we were talking actually about how we could, in future, and the panel might want to bear this in mind for its recommendations, roll that out wider. You know, reach out to perhaps the bids across the borough, the business improvement districts. You know, when we talk about employers, and I think mentioned earlier by Dan or Ian, in that corner at least, about engagement with employers, I think it was you Councillor Crawford, you know, it might be a good way to start employers, getting them to think, actually, I can employ someone with additional needs, I can employ someone who I wouldn't otherwise have thought of employing through that reverse mentoring. So whether we could expand that in future is something you might want to think about. And then in terms of care leavers as well, I just wanted to mention the takeover of the council day. So we have get care leavers to come in and kind of run us for a day. I think it's the 30th of October this year, 31st. So myself and I think Councillor Mason are also involved in that, so we'll be engaging with some of those sessions there. And there's also, in terms of care leavers coming back, obviously the annual celebration we hold where we get some of our care leavers to come back and tell us their stories, so that we don't just kind of track them on a spreadsheet, but we actually get them in here and talk to us as well, so we know what they're up to and the impact all these things have had on them, and that we can improve them as well. So just wanted to mention those few things.
Yeah, just wanted to know, as part of PFA, especially for care leavers, are they educated in sort of not academic skills, but sort of more life skills, like how to open a bank account, difference between like your current account, savings account, even how to cook basic meals, that kind of thing?
So the range of needs that our young people have are wide and varied. So we now have, for example, one now year 12 girl achieved the highest Progress 8 score, and Corinne talked about progress measures earlier, of her entire school in the summer. So she got the absolute best grades above all of her peers, and this was a mainstream school. So she's now care leaver as going into year 12, and she's moving and engaging with her A-level courses. The other end of the scale, from a care leaver's perspective, we have young people who are non-verbal, who are attending specialist education provision, and so they, on our outcomes, if you measured them against GCSEs, they failed. They massively underachieved. But of course, that's not a fair measure. So they then receive bespoke education tailored to their particular needs, which would be perhaps not even as advanced as you suggested around understanding a bank account, or because of their educational profile, and everything in between. And so that's the care experience cohort. The PFA cohort is a similar, well, is all children within the HCP, and it's specifically thinking around children with disabilities and more complex needs. So it tends to be more at that more complex end of the spectrum. But nevertheless, those young people, absolutely with the right support and the right processes and systems, and as we've had mentioned, is about employers, colleges, schools having the reassurance and understanding of how to meet those needs of those young people within a mainstream setting. More of those young people can go forward and thrive in those settings. And the work that you've heard about this evening about ethos and approach and understanding is all part of that planning and development to meet the needs of those young people effectively and cost effectively as possible.
Thank you. Yeah, Robert. Yeah.
And if I may, Andrew, Councillor, just in terms of general pathway planning for our children who are moving to become care leavers, that will start from, you know, their teens. All those children will have developed pathway plans. And they will also have personal advisors who are lead professionals who will work with members of Andrew's team, with John's team, to ensure that there is a rounded offer, but it's a bespoke offer to meet their needs, and it covers bank accounts. But also some of that work will be led by foster carers or you know, other carers in residential provision, where the child has the best relationship, really, and then professionals will offer some particular advice and guidance as well. Yeah, yeah, and it's acting as a parent. Yeah, that's the key thing. Indeed, indeed.
Thank you. Councillor Crawford.
Sorry, Chair. There was just one addition. I wondered, we talked a lot about, and thank you to Councillor Blacker for adding on all those really important things. I think one of the strengths of this authority has been how we've run with that agenda, and there's no limit to our ambition in terms of where it can take us. And I do think it's genuinely informed by the people who provide the lived experience. I mean, that's certainly been my the feedback I've got from some of those individuals. I just wondered, we talked a little bit about the sort of reverse mentoring and mentoring, and I know from my own experience meeting people who achieved in various different fields was so inspiring to me and some of my cohort. And from some of the work I've done over the summer with Paralympics GB, we obviously have 3 Paralympic medalists from Paris, who 2 of them based here and 1 of them grew up here. I know they really want to give back to their local communities. I wonder if it's something, if I could pass that information on to the chair, to the portfolio holder, to Mr. Sells, and that could percolate certainly to the virtual school. Andrew, I think it'd be a really good avenue but also to everybody in terms of that wider conversation about the conversations we have with employers on how people can make a difference, because I do think that the nature of that conversation is changing because of the achievements, whether they be in elite sport, whether they be in business, whether they be in education. And I was particularly taken by the example Mr. Martin referenced most recently with regards to that young lady who will now be in year 12, I imagine. You know, that is not unusual in terms of when our care leavers or our SEND children are given the room to achieve. You know, they are very motivated and they will deliver. So yeah, I'd also like us to recommend that we commend particularly the work of the virtual school and the staff members who are involved in that. And if, Andrew, you could pass that on to the other members of the team who aren't here this evening. I mean, it really is a phenomenal success story, Chair, with not very much in the way of resource either, I don't think, you know, and yeah, wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll certainly pass those comments on. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's John Redmond regarding Ian Jenkins Department Youth Service.
Ian has asked me to say that there is also a committee meeting regarding the Youth Justice Service next week, at which he will be at, and has prepared a paper. And but looking particularly at NEETs this evening, as you've seen, the figures look worse than the borough average for NEETs, and they are worse. But the thing I would really highlight is that the cohort is very small, and so even 1 or 2 people that are NEET or become EAT can swing the percentages enormously. So unlike the overall, where you need quite a few people moving to make a difference, actually on the YJS, one or two makes a massive difference. And Ealing is pretty good nationally for its EAT figures. We have recently put in some additional resource to try and bolster that. The target used to be 87%. It's now been reduced to 75% of young offenders being in EAT on the last day of their order. And so they could be NEAT on the last day of their order and then they start a job the next day, but they don't count for our figures. It could go the other way, of course, I suppose, but to balance it out. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of effort goes into these young people. There's a dedicated connections worker, but also all the YJS workers are very much focused on preventing reoffending, obviously, but also the best way of doing that is to help young people engage in something positive and useful in terms of education, training, employment, earning money, having prospects for the future. That is proven time and time again to be the best way to reduce reoffending. And so I'm happy to take questions. Otherwise, I propose to leave it there.
Any questions? Yeah.
Chair, it isn't really a fair question to ask John, given the detail of this report, but I'll throw it your way, if I may, in terms of a suggested recommendation, or at least something for you to follow up when you take updates. It's on page 41 with regards to the turnaround programme. Now, I think some of this is related to the timeframes for providing this information. So the success of the turnaround programme is phenomenal based on those figures, but it's a theme of this evening where we've done something of this magnitude. We want to try and build on it. My concern is the final paragraph talks about the planned offer of additional early help support to schools was not achieved due to the initial setup of the turnaround programme, and then that member of staff going on a maternity leave. It is now likely that any early help offered to schools would need to be built into any bids for funding for the continuation of turnaround for March 2025. So it's one of those really difficult ones where I'm looking at an officer or somebody to sort of reassure that if turnarounds had this remarkable impact, and yet we need to continue funding that in some way, cognizant of the funding envelope for our local authority, which is going to initiate or require some very difficult political decisions around what we fund and what we don't fund. This is one where, I mean, there may be an update following the information being put together, and I appreciate Ian's the best person to speak to this, but given the progress that we've made, this is something that we really need to fund, or we really need to be having that discussion with our educational institutions about where we get that funding from to reach that cohort.
Thank you, Councillor. I think it's it's a valid point that you raised there. I think it would be helpful for Ian to come next week and maybe comment on that. It's important to note that a number of these programmes, they are generated from national funding, and we are constantly reviewing our services within the context of need, with principles that are related to ensuring that there is strength in our universal offer, but that we can actually target the children and young people who require services quickly as well. And that's something that we have to do constantly, and it's looking at the impact of this work. So I think from my perspective, I'm clearly wanting the very best outcomes for children and young people, and so what I can say that we're committed to is that ongoing reviewing and testing of the impact of these services. But I think it'd be helpful if Ian comments further more directly next week, and then maybe we can take that on and the committee can consider, with Ian's comments, the broader focus on that area moving forward.
Can someone just advise which meeting that is next week? Is it of this
OSC.
panel?
Oh,
Sorry?
OSC.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments?
Chair, if you're gonna be at that OSC meeting, right? If you chair this committee, no? All right. Well, if I take it up with Councillor Wall to make sure that that's something that is communicated, I totally take Mr. South's point, which is that if this programme has been so successful, we might not need to divert so much resource into that particular thing the following year, and we can reconfigure it in a way that supports the people who need it. But my concern is that something that we planned to do last year hadn't been able to be put in place, and it cuts across about 3 different portfolios, I imagine. So yeah, we'll find a way of getting an answer on that. Thank you, Chair. Pick up a couple of those recommendations, if we might.
So,
Yep. Go on.
no, you go ahead.
No,
You go
go
ahead.
on.
What I was going to suggest was that they come out in minutes, possibly, because they've been fairly scattered, haven't they? And I don't want to miss anything. Let's bring it up into the next meeting.
Sure.
There was a discussion earlier on about the Racial Equality Commission element and the racial equality element of some of these targets, ideas, programmes. And I wanted to make sure that we as a panel weren't white-splaining these issues. And I would say both Councillor Kwanzaa and Councillor Alexander have remarkable lived experience in this very sector in respect of their viewpoints. So as long as Chair and Vice Chair, you're able to take their views at some point with regard to that particular one, and also if Councillor Kwanzaa's too modest to mention her own work in the voluntary sector and the educational sector with a large number of these people is exceptional, and should certainly, I know it does form part of the council's plans and programmes through our various voluntary sector partners, but she's too modest to mention her own role in certainly so many of Acton's young people achieving, and I think we should commend that.
I totally agree.
Sure.
As well as so the 2 other. I think we captured, and I think Cornelia and colleagues will be able to capture some of those earlier challenges and questions that we talked about. But there was just one more ask, which is, this is obviously a panel to which colleagues come on every year. I wonder if there's some wider expertise amongst the councillors who aren't part of this panel, many of whom have been teachers, many of whom have had that educational experience and know their communities so well. If there's some way that they can all feed into some of these topics through that ongoing review and reshaping, reconfiguring of the learning partnership. I'll leave that with you to consider, but maybe a briefing for all councillors on some of these points. I'm sure there will be one scheduled at some point, but perhaps a refresher or an ask for ideas. We do that across various directorates from time to time. It might be worth looking at whether we can schedule one.
Yep, sure, thank you very much. I think we can ask our chief whips to allocate some of those councillors onto this panel. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, and that's the end of meeting. Our next meeting is on 14th of January. This meeting is closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much, too.
So, forgot one thing, I want to thank all the officers for coming here and Councillor Blacker, making an effort. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.